The first thing Emma noticed about the path was how unnaturally silent it was. The kind of silence that pressed against your ears, making the faintest sound feel deafening. It wasn't marked on any map, and the locals swore it never existed. But there it was, a crooked, dirt-laden trail snaking its way into the dense forest behind her new home. The villagers called it the Path of the Forgotten, the Path of the Forgotten. It was a name they whispered, eyes darting as though just speaking of it could awaken something terrible. Emma, a skeptic to her core, dismissed their warnings as local superstition, tales to scare off curious wanderers. But tonight, curiosity whispered louder than caution. Armed with only a flashlight and the daring foolishness of a bored city transplant, Emma stepped onto the path. The air instantly changed, growing thick and cloying, like breathing through damp wool. The trees, tall and ancient, leaned in unnaturally close, their gnarled branches curling like skeletal fingers overhead. Each step seemed to pull her further from reality. The earthy scent of moss gave way to something more metallic, sharper. Blood? No, she told herself. It's your imagination. But the growing dampness on her boots suggested otherwise. She pointed her flashlight downward, heart hammering, and froze. The ground wasn't dirt anymore. It was flesh, pale, veined, and pulsating like a living organism. Veins spidered out beneath her feet, leading further down the path. She should have turned back. Every part of her screamed to run. But something tugged at her, something she couldn't name. As she moved forward, the whispers began, low and guttural, just on the edge of hearing. Emma. The sound of her name slithered through the air, spoken by a voice she didn't recognize. Her flashlight flickered, and the beam caught something ahead, a figure standing perfectly still in the middle of the path. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound firm. The figure didn't move. It was tall and wrapped in what looked like rotted cloth, its head lolling unnaturally to one side. And then, slowly, it raised its arm to point at her. Emma's body went cold. She took a step back, but her foot sank into the ground with a wet squelch. Looking down, she realized she wasn't just standing on flesh. She was being swallowed by it. The ground pulsed, tightening around her ankle, pulling her down inch by inch. Panic surged. She yanked at her leg, but the more she struggled, the deeper she sank. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice tearing through the suffocating silence. The figure tilted its head further, its neck cracking loudly, and began to shuffle toward her. The whispers grew louder, morphing into a cacophony of voices, pleading, crying, screaming. "Join us," they begged. "Don't leave us behind." Faces began to emerge in the flesh beneath her, twisted, eyeless, their mouths agape in eternal agony. She could feel their hands clawing at her legs, their nails biting into her skin as they dragged her down. And then, she saw it. The path didn't end in the distance. It simply opened. A gaping, black void stretched before her, its edges pulsating like a breathing wound. Inside, countless figures writhed, their mouths twisted into silent screams, their bodies forever trapped in the infinite darkness. Emma's flashlight died, plunging her into total darkness. But the last thing she heard before the void consumed her was a voice, soft, childlike, and eerily familiar. "Welcome home." The darkness wasn't empty. It pressed against Emma like a living thing, wrapping her in a suffocating grip. She couldn't tell if a body was falling, sinking, or simply ceasing to exist. The whispers hadn't stopped. If anything, they grew louder, surrounding her, drilling into her skull. But they weren't just whispers anymore. They were memories. Her memories. "Remember us, Emma," one voice hissed, its tone dripping with venom. It sounded like her mother's voice, but warped, hollow. Another voice chimed in, younger, sadder. "You left me here, Emma." She gasped. That one belonged to her younger brother, the brother she hadn't thought about in years. The faces began to materialize again, not beneath her feet this time, but in the surrounding void. The eyeless sockets stared accusingly, their mouths moving in unison, chanting her name over and over. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body felt weightless, yet bound. Her arms, her legs, her chest all gripped by an invisible force. A faint glow appeared in the distance, pulling her attention. It wasn't comforting. It was pale and sickly, like the glow of a rotting corpse. But it was something. She reached out, clawing through the oppressive darkness as the glow grew closer. With every inch she moved, the voices got louder, the memories clearer. She was 9 years old, sitting at the edge of a lake, her brother Tommy beside her. He was crying, begging her not to leave him alone. "Come on, Emma, don't go so far." His voice echoed, distorted by the void. The memory flashed violently, Emma running ahead, ignoring his pleas. Then came the scream, a blood-curdling scream that still haunted her dreams. And after that, nothing. She had never told anyone about that day, not even her parents. The glow expanded, revealing a vast chamber carved out of flesh and bone. The walls pulsed, veins throbbing as if the place itself was alive. In the center stood a grotesque altar, built from jagged teeth and shards of bone. On it lay a book, bound in what looked like human skin. Its pages glowed faintly, the words written in a language Emma couldn't understand but instinctively feared. The figure from the path was there, standing motionless by the altar. Its head snapped toward her as she approached, its eyeless gaze burning into her soul. The whispers fell silent. The only sound now was the wet squelching of the floor beneath her boots and the ragged sound of her breathing. "Why am I here?" she managed to choke out. Her voice sounded small, fragile in the vastness of the chamber. The figure didn't answer with words. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing the book in full. The moment her eyes locked onto it, her mind was flooded with visions. Twisted, horrifying images of people she didn't recognize, but somehow knew. A woman being dragged into the void, screaming as her skin peeled away. A man impaled on a tree of bones, his mouth sewn shut with strands of sinew. A child, no older than 5, being swallowed whole by the ground, her tiny hand reaching out in a silent plea. Then came the final image, her own face, contorted in terror, her eyes wide as the figure loomed over her. "Emma." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was everywhere, deep and resonant, shaking the chamber itself. "You walk the path of the forgotten. Now you must remember." She staggered back, her hands flying to her ears as if she could block out the sound. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her, ripping through her mind like claws. The memories came rushing back, each one sharper, more painful than the last. Tommy, drowning in the lake. Emma watching, frozen in fear, too scared to jump in and save him. The guilt that followed her every day after, though she buried it deep. The way she convinced herself it wasn't her fault, that it was an accident. But the path knew the truth. She had forgotten him, forgotten his cries, his face, his desperate struggle for air. The figure moved closer, its skeletal hand reaching out. It gestured to the book, its eyeless gaze unyielding. Emma shook her head violently. "No, I don't want this," she screamed. "You already chose." The voice replied, calm but merciless. "The moment you stepped onto the path, you gave yourself to us. To him." Emma whispered, trembling. The chamber shook as the floor split open beneath the altar. A monstrous form began to rise, its body a writhing mass of limbs, mouths, and eyes. It was endless, its form stretching far beyond what her mind could comprehend. The very sight of it drove spikes of pain through her skull. The figure turned toward the monstrosity and bowed. "The Forgotten One," it intoned, reverently. Emma stumbled backward, but the ground shifted beneath her, forcing her closer to the altar. The book began to glow brighter, its pages flipping wildly on their own. The words scrawled across them rearranged, forming one name. Her name? "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, no." The whispers returned, but now they were different. They weren't angry or accusing. They were pleading, begging. "Set us free, Emma," they cried. "Read the book." In this, her trembling hands moved toward the book, as if guided by an unseen force. The figure stepped back, its job done. The Forgotten One loomed overhead, its countless mouths opening in anticipation. Emma's fingers touched the book, and the world around her exploded into screams. The screams hit Emma like a physical force, reverberating through her body as if her very bones were cracking under the weight of the sound. Her fingers trembled on the surface of the book. It was warm, no, hot, like touching the skin of something alive. She wanted to pull her hand away, but her body refused to obey. Her fingers dug into the fleshy cover, nails scraping as if trying to find purchase. The words on the pages seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, twisting and shifting in shapes her mind couldn't grasp. The Forgotten Ones' mouths began to move, but instead of sound, a foul black mist poured out, coiling around her ankles. It burned where it touched her skin, leaving trails of raw, blistering flesh. The whispers grew louder, but now they weren't just voices. They were cries of pain, the agonized wails of the countless souls swallowed by the path before her. "Read," the figure commanded, its voice flat and void of emotion. "To remember is to free them, to free yourself. I don't want this," Emma screamed, her voice cracking. "I didn't ask for any of this." The figure tilted its head, a motion so sharp it looked like its neck might snap. "You did," it said simply. "You walked the path, and then it was there again. That memory. The lake." Tommy's hand, flailing above the surface. The cold indifference she forced into her heart to protect herself. The way she turned her back and ran, leaving him to die alone. The memory hit her like a punch to the gut, forcing the air from her lungs. "I didn't know," she sobbed, clutching the edges of the book. "I was a child. I didn't mean." "Intent does not absolve," the figure interrupted. "Guilt stains, and guilt calls." The book began to hum under her palms, the pages turning faster now, flipping with a frantic urgency as if the thing inside it was alive and desperate to escape. Her name, carved in bloody letters, danced across every page. But there were other names too, names she didn't recognize, names of the damned. The Forgotten One shifted closer, its massive body rippling and writhing like a sea of suffering. One of its mouths stretched impossibly wide, and within, Emma could see them, people. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Their faces pressed against the walls of flesh, their hands clawing at the edges of the mouth, trying to escape. The black mist poured from their eyes and mouths as they screamed silently, their anguish eternal. And then she saw Tommy, his small, fragile frame trapped among the others. His face was pale, his lips cracked and bleeding. But his eyes were locked on hers, wide with fear and accusation. "Emma," he mouthed, "help me." Her knees buckled, and she fell forward, her hands landing on the book. It burned against her palms, but she couldn't move away. She couldn't tear her gaze from him. The figure stepped closer, its shadow stretching long across the altar. "Read," it repeated. "Only the one who remembers can set them free." Her mind screamed at her to run, to fight, to do anything but obey. But Tommy's face, his tiny, fragile body. How could she turn her back on him again? With shaking hands, she opened the book to the first page. The letters twisted and writhed, but as she stared, they began to make sense. The words carved into her brain like jagged glass, each one spoken in a voice that wasn't hers. "I give her my blood," she read, her voice barely above a whisper. "I give her my soul." The chamber shuddered violently. The Forgotten One roared, its many mouths opening wider, a vortex of black mist swirling around it. The faces within it screamed louder, their hands clawing desperately at the edges of its monstrous form. "I take the guilt. I take the pain." The words poured from her lips faster now, each one tearing through her like a blade. Blood began to drip from her nose, her ears, her eyes. The book absorbed it hungrily, the pages growing darker, wetter. The altar began to crack, the teeth and bones splintering as the ground beneath it heaved. The figure stepped back, bowing low as the Forgotten One's massive form began to shift, its many limbs stretching toward her. "I offer myself to the Forgotten One." The final words left her mouth in a broken sob. The book erupted in flames, the fire spreading instantly across the altar, the walls, the ceiling. The chamber filled with the stench of burning flesh as the screams of the trapped souls reached a deafening crescendo. The ground beneath her split open, and she fell. Fell through darkness deeper than anything she'd ever known. Fell through memories, through pain, through every regret she'd ever buried. And when she hit the ground, it wasn't the ground at all. It was him, the forgotten one, his flesh, his eyes, his mouth, all writhing and pulsating around her. She tried to move, but her body was pinned, held in place by the weight of countless souls pressing down on her. Their faces surrounded her, their hands clawing at her skin, their voices a single, unified cry. "Save us!" In the distance, she saw him again. Tommy. But he was different now. His face was twisted, his eyes black as the void. He pointed at her, his tiny finger trembling. "You left me," he said, his voice echoing endlessly. "You let me die." "I'm sorry," she screamed, tears mixing with blood as they streamed down her face. "I'm sorry, Tommy. Please. I'm so sorry." But his face didn't soften. His expression was cold, unfeeling. "It's too late," he whispered. The flesh beneath her began to shift, pulling her deeper into the forgotten one's body. The black mist poured over her, filling her lungs, choking her. She clawed at the air, at the surrounding faces, but there was no escape. And then, just as the last of the light disappeared, she heard a voice that wasn't hers, or Tommy's, or any of the countless souls around her. It was deep and ancient, a voice that belonged to the void itself. "You are mine now, Emma." And then, there was nothing. There was no sensation, no sound, no light, only emptiness. Emma thought she had ceased to exist, swallowed whole by the forgotten one's infinite abyss. But slowly, the void began to change. It wasn't gone. It shifted, morphing into something tangible, something worse. She awoke, or thought she did, lying on her back, staring at a sky that wasn't a sky. It was a swirling mass of deep reds and blacks, like the inside of a dying storm. The air was thick, suffocating, carrying the scent of decay and something sharp, acidic. She tried to move but found her limbs heavy, unresponsive. When she looked down, her body wasn't her own. Her skin was pale and cracked, her veins blackened like tar. "Get up," the voice said. It wasn't the figure's voice or the forgotten one's. This one was colder, more commanding. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emma pushed herself upright, every movement sending shocks of pain through her unfamiliar body. The ground beneath her was a patchwork of flesh and bone, pulsating faintly with each step. Ahead, a twisted path stretched into the distance, lined by towering trees that looked like they had been carved from human remains. The branches were arms, the leaves translucent skin, and the roots bled a dark, viscous liquid. She was back on the path, but it wasn't the same. This was deeper. This was the core. "You have remembered," the voice continued, smooth and cruel. "But remembrance is not enough. You must now decide." "Decide?" Emma croaked, her throat raw. "Decide what?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the ground beneath her shifted, and the path ahead came alive. From the twisted, organic soil, shapes began to emerge. First small, then larger, their forms warping and snapping into focus like grotesque sculptures clawing their way into existence. They were people. No, fragments of people. Their bodies were incomplete, with limbs missing or grotesquely elongated. Their faces were warped, some with mouths that stretched from ear to ear, others eyeless but still somehow staring at her. They moaned softly, a low, guttural sound that sent chills racing down her spine. At the front of the procession stood Tommy, not the boy she remembered, but something else. His body was frail and skeletal, his skin gray and lifeless. His eyes, pits of darkness, locked onto hers. "You made me this," he said, his voice layered with pain and anger. "You left me." Emma staggered back, her hands trembling. "I didn't mean to. I was scared." "Your fear killed me," he hissed, stepping closer. "Your guilt brought you here." "I didn't choose this," she screamed. "I didn't ask to walk this path." Tommy tilted his head, a gesture so eerily similar to the figure that it sent a fresh wave of dread washing over her. You've been walking it your whole life. You just didn't know it. Behind him, the other figures began to move. They reached for her with twisted, claw-like hands, their broken mouths chanting in unison. "Remember us. Free us." Emma stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the fleshy ground. "How? How do I free you?" The chanting stopped. The figures froze, their gazes turning upward to the swirling, bleeding sky. And then the voice returned, booming and resonant, shaking the ground beneath her. "To free them, you must take their place." Emma's heart stopped. "What?" The voice ignored her protest. "The path demands balance. For every soul released, another must be bound. This is the way of the forgotten. Choose, Emma, their freedom or your own." She turned to Tommy, her heart breaking at the sight of him. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't leave you here." Tommy stepped closer, his small hand reaching out to hers. "Then stay," he said softly. "Stay with me." The words were like a knife to her chest. She looked at the figures behind him, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Their faces were a blur of suffering and desperation, each one silently begging for release. The voice returned, harsher now, impatient. "Decide, Emma." Her mind raced. She couldn't do this. She couldn't choose. If she stayed, she would be bound to this hell forever, consumed by the Forgotten One. But if she left, she would be damning them all, including Tommy, to an eternity of torment. "There has to be another way," she cried, her voice cracking. "Please, there has to be another way." The ground beneath her split open, and from the fissure, the figure emerged once more. Its head tilted, its eyeless gaze boring into her. It raised one skeletal hand and gestured toward her chest. "The book is within you now," it said. "It holds the power to change the path. But power comes with a cost." Emma's hand instinctively moved to her chest, where she felt the faintest pulse of warmth beneath her skin. The book. It was inside her, embedded in her very being. She could feel its pages turning, its power humming like a caged beast. "What cost?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing a dark, gaping chasm at the end of the path. The faces of the damned stared up at her from within, their hands reaching out, their mouths silently screaming. Emma knew what she had to do. The realization hit her like a physical blow, and she fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. If she opened the book, if she used its power, she could free them all. But it wouldn't be simple. The path wouldn't let her leave unscathed. It would demand something in return, something she wasn't sure she could give. Her soul. The Forgotten One's presence loomed behind her, its many mouths whispering promises of pain, of suffering, of eternal torment. The figures around her began to close in, their hands clawing at her, their voices desperate. "Choose," the voice thundered. With a shaking hand, Emma reached into herself, feeling for the book. The warmth grew stronger, hotter, until it burned like fire. She screamed as she pulled, feeling her very essence tearing apart. And then she held it, the book, pulsing and alive, its pages wet with her blood. The figures stopped. The whispers fell silent. Even the Forgotten One seemed to hesitate, its massive form pulling back, watching her. Emma opened the book, and the world exploded into chaos. The explosion wasn't one of fire or light, but of memories. The book's pages unraveled into the air, swirling around Emma like a hurricane of guilt, pain, and regret. Every soul trapped within the Forgotten One surged toward her, their memories slamming into her mind. She could feel their anguish, their final moments, their terror as they were devoured by the path. The figures on the path screamed in unison, their bodies stretching and twisting as if tethered to the book. The Forgotten One roared, its monstrous form writhing in fury. Its mouths gnashed and snapped, its limbs clawing at the air as it tried to reclaim its prey. Emma's grip on the book tightened, her body trembling under the weight of the souls pouring into her. She could feel them clawing at her mind, their desperation overwhelming. But amidst the chaos, one thought burned bright. Asterisk, this has to end. Asterisk. She turned to Tommy, his small, broken form standing just a few feet away. His dark eyes softened, a flicker of the boy she had once known shining through the void. "You can do it," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "You can set us free." Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her hands trembling. She could feel the book's power consuming her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The Forgotten One roared again, its massive form descending toward her, but she didn't flinch. She opened the book, the pages glowing with a sickly, pulsating light. "I give of myself," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I give everything." The book responded, its light growing brighter, more blinding. The surrounding figures began to dissolve, their twisted forms unraveling into streams of light that were pulled into the book. Tommy was the last to go. He stepped forward, his small hand brushing against hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. And then he was gone, his light swallowed by the book. Emma fell to her knees, the book now searing hot in her hands. The Forgotten One let out a deafening roar, its form collapsing inward, its many mouths screaming in fury as it was dragged into the void. The ground beneath her shook violently, cracks spreading in all directions as the path began to disintegrate. The book's light turned dark, its power surging toward her. She could feel it tearing at her, pulling her soul apart piece by piece. She had freed them all, but the cost was greater than she could have imagined. The path demanded balance, and now it wanted her. As the last of the Forgotten One disappeared, Emma felt herself being pulled into the book. Her body dissolved into the same light that had freed the others, her essence consumed by the pages. But as her vision blurred and her body faded, she felt a strange sense of peace. She had done it. She had freed them. The path was gone. The Forgotten One was gone. And Emma was no more.